Welcome everybody to OVA webinar number 4. I'm Jennifer Garrison and I am delighted to be joining you from the Buck Institute. I am here with a very special guest who I will introduce in a moment. I wanted to step back and remind everybody, especially those of you who haven't watched before, what we're talking about here. So the Buck Institute is devoted to understanding age and age-related diseases, and that's because aging is a public health pandemic. Age is really the major risk factor for chronic diseases, and soon there's going to be more people over the age of 65 than there are under the age of 5 for the first time in our history. And of course, although we've recognized age as a risk factor for a very long time, modern medicine has largely ignored it as a therapeutic target, and that's changing. So thanks to basic science discoveries here and in other places, we now know that biological aging is malleable, and if we can figure out how it works, then we can exploit that knowledge to reduce our overall disease risk. But as we're making progress in extending healthy longevity, if we don't address reproductive longevity, and particularly female reproductive aging, then gender inequality is going to get worse, not better. And that's because menopause makes a woman's body age faster. We've talked about this in previous webinars. We'll probably talk about it in the future, but I just wanted to put that out there right now at the beginning. Beyond reproduction, the end of fertility sets off this cascade of negative health effects in a woman's body. So a few years ago, here at the Buck Institute, we launched a moonshot to tackle female reproductive aging. In partnership with the BioEcho Foundation, we're dreaming big. We established a Center for Reproductive Longevity and Equality here at the Buck. It's the first facility that focuses solely on reproductive longevity as it relates to aging. We want to figure out what leads to reproductive decline in women and develop interventions to slow and reverse it. But to strengthen and broaden our reach, we established a global consortium for reproductive longevity and equality. I'm the director of that initiative, and I'm also a faculty member here at the Buck Institute. And our goal is to facilitate and accelerate translating basic scientific discoveries from the lab into useful products and therapies that'll change women's lives. So if our goal is to extend reproductive span, then we need to engage an army of creative scientists, of visionaries, of physicians, of people in industry to work collaboratively on this project. In essence, we're trying to build a field. And we're envisioning the consortium as an innovation hub that supports a quickly growing knowledge base to build a sustainable and impactful research field. So as part of building this amazing network, I get to talk to incredible people every day who are working in this space. These are thought leaders, physicians, scientists, entrepreneurs, and funders. And I'm excited to introduce you to some of these people here on the OVA webinar for discussions about building the ecosystem. So that brings me to our guest today. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Daisy Robinton. She is a scientist. She got her PhD from Harvard. She's also a writer, a lifestyle coach, a guru, a model, and most importantly, she is the co-founder and CEO of Oviva Therapeutics. So Oviva's mission is to improve women's health at all stages through developing therapeutics that support and extend ovarian function. So this is one of the companies that we're really excited about. She's also the director of women's health at Cambrian Biopharma. Daisy, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm so glad that we're doing this.
Me too. I'm really curious to know, how did you come to be in this space? There aren't that many people yet working on female reproductive aging. How is it that you got here?
Yeah, it's a funny story, a bit roundabout. As you mentioned, I'm a scientist. I did my training in molecular biology, and most of that was focused around stem cell biology and genetics. And I didn't really have a focus for a lot of that in the reproductive space specifically, but as I was working, I always tended to use a lens of looking at early developmental biology and genetic programs and things that helped enable embryos to grow and become full organisms, which is my favorite subject matter, and then how some of those programs would get repurposed later in pathological states and lead to disease and aging, among other things. And so really that path, it took me down a rabbit hole, I guess, of understanding aging biology better and wanting to better understand how we could support what I like to think of as resilient living from a biological point of view. And it wasn't actually until I had already finished my PhD and was well within my postdoc that I realized that in the conversation around aging and biology, very few people, if any, really speak about the ovaries as one of the first organs that really decline in aging and then lead to systemic aging in the rest of the body. And as a female person, I thought this was strange, but also somewhat annoying. And as I learned more about ovarian physiology and female physiology and how our bodies change over time, I just basically became infuriated by the lack of knowledge that exists, just basic biology, but also translational biology that would help support female well-being. And so with that, I think it became really obvious to me that there's a lot of unanswered questions in this field. And also there's a lot of very interesting science, because the way that the ovaries change over time, the impacts that has to our systemic well-being, they touch every part of our health. And we just don't ask a lot of those questions. And there's so much that we don't know. And so, I moved into this space with a fervent belief that we could really improve well-being in people by just starting to answer some of these questions, both from the scientific standpoint, from the clinical standpoint, obviously putting more funding in. I know we'll talk about all of these things, but it really came out of anger and passion around seeing this huge unmet need and these huge unanswered questions and this extremely interesting biology that was untapped.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? What we don't know, the lack of knowledge, and particularly not just, as scientists, but as women. A lot of women don't know what's going on in their bodies, which is, how I came to this, thinking about what's happening in my own body and then thinking about what was going on with the research in my lab. So touching on something you just said, we chose the title of this webinar to talk about reframing women's health. And really, it is an imperative, and it's true. It makes me angry, too, that there's so little known around what's happening, both during, the young periods of a woman's life, but also during aging. So why do you think women's health needs reframing right now?
I think it's needed it for a long time. We treat women's health as a subcategory, even though it encompasses at least half of the population. And the vast majority of biomedical research and clinical development and diagnostics and care systems have all been based on male physiology, which really just doesn't serve the female sex very well. And, there's a couple little points that I want to add. It's rewinding a little bit, but I didn't really touch on these. And you reminded me that moving into this space was in part an understanding of my own ignorance, which I didn't realize I had. I was 30 or 31 years old when I first went to a fertility clinic just to understand, where am I at? My fertility. I want to have kids one day, and I hope that everything's okay, but I've had a few friends that had a hard time, and I was recently single then, and so I went to go have this consult. And what I was shocked to learn was that I was horribly ignorant about how our bodies work and horribly ignorant around a lot of the things that relate to fertility. And, when we think about reframing women's health, there's so much that we need to do to support women's health, but there's also this huge gap of education that exists for women and for anybody.
For everybody, right?
Basic things like this. But certainly, we all get the sex talk, we get the puberty talk in school, and we don't really get any other structured education around the hormonal changes that happen throughout the course of our life, even though they deeply touch on our well-being, whether it's family planning, if that's something that you want, but also when you think about menopause and the huge shift that happens in perimenopause, which can be 8 to 10 years, and then you go into menopause and that changes a whole lot too. And we just don't talk about that. We don't learn about it. And it's not until it's upon us that we're really saying, what is going on? And oftentimes people will go to the doctor with all these weird symptoms, and it'll take a while to really figure out that this is normal, and just no one really prepared us for what that transition looks like in the same way that we have been prepared as young girls for changes that happen during puberty. I mean, we really need to do more to allow women to have choice and information in order to live in a positive and resilient way with the shifts that are inevitably going to occur for us.
Well, I hope they're not inevitable.
Currently inevitable, but we're working on it.
Currently inevitable, but we are working on it. That's the whole point of what we're doing here. But yeah, it's actually, I'm embarrassed to admit that I learned I went and did a deep dive on female fertility when it became important because, experiments in my lab had taken us in that direction. I didn't know, I didn't understand that, by the time I was in my early 30s, my ovaries were already considered geriatric. I didn't understand that we don't know, the most basic things about what makes a good egg, about, just so many things that were going on in my own body I was completely ignorant of, which is, I think, the case for many women. But yeah, hopefully it's not inevitable, but certainly having more information and also just opening up the discussion around both fertility and also menopause. I think that there's a real groundswell of interest and information that's actually happening right now that's flooding flooding the social media and really, you're living proof, your company and the things that you're doing with Cambrian around women's health. All of these initiatives are sort of emblematic of this growing interest in trying to both understand and change the narrative around women's health, and particularly around female fertility. So, yay. You said a few things actually, that, there's a lot of reasons why we don't have the answers to these basic questions, but I wanted to really focus on a couple of those. I see it as two problems. One is the lack of funding, and the other is the lack of data. So thinking about the lack of funding, historically, research on women's health in general has been dramatically underfunded. When you look at the actual numbers, it's, infinitesimally small compared to the issues that women are facing. And, we should be providing women with not just information, but also the freedom and the choice to decide if and when they want to have children, to decide, to be able to take control of their health with respect to the things that happen during menopause. And, we have not dedicated the resources to that category of health and well-being as we have to other things. So I was, we were talking about this, and you mentioned the number of doctors that have been trained in menopause.
Yeah. The what is it? North American Menopause Society has a special training program to treat patients that are going through menopause, and I don't remember the exact figure right now of the number of doctors that are trained in this, but it's shockingly low. I think it's on the order of a few thousand.
Just a few thousand, exactly.
Yeah, in the whole country. So, and part of the issue there, as I was alluding to earlier, is that there's a whole host of symptoms that can happen with menopause that are not necessarily obvious in terms of pointing to what's happening. And certainly if you're entering early menopause, or if you're in perimenopause and it's not necessarily a flag for a doctor, a lot of women actually get misdiagnosed for conditions that they don't have. And really what's happening is that your hormones are going a bit haywire, and no one's recognizing that that's the thing that we should be looking at and trying to modulate in some way. That being said, if we did know that was happening, there's not a whole lot of options for how to modulate that and how to make things a bit more regular to ease that transition, which I think, both of those are big issues. I think of diagnostic criteria as a huge field, right, for innovation in terms of where to focus our attention in women's health, and having physicians trained to better understand how a woman transitions into perimenopause and then into menopause and then postmenopause. If we continue to have menopause forever, that will be helpful for us to really understand with greater granularity, and extending even beyond that. I think we've definitely had this conversation before. There's more to it than our hormones, right? It's actually holistic to our whole health and well-being. And I think part of the issue with how we sort of subcategorize women's health is that we're really drawing a box around something that is really, it touches everything. And so again, like when we're talking about diagnostics, the diagnostics for women who are experiencing heart attack, for example, if you apply the male diagnostics, they don't work as well. So a lot of women are misdiagnosed when they're having a heart attack because they don't tend to get the same constellation of symptoms that men always get, the shooting down the arm, and there's a few other ones that are sort of the gold standard diagnostics for heart attack that just don't transfer between the sexes. And so I think that part of this is really just, let's do a better job of understanding what things look like in a female body. whether it's regular health stuff or regular health problems that are common, such as heart attack or stroke, but also this very important shift that does happen if you're living to age 50 or so. Currently, you will enter menopause, and so we need to understand what that means. We already know that it negatively affects our cognitive health, our cardiovascular health, our immune function, sleep, sexual function, our mood, all of these things in a really dramatic way for most women. And it's just not good enough how we've dealt with it so far.
It's not good enough, I agree. And yeah, thinking about women's health as a subspecialty or a niche thing, even though it's 50% of the population, is kind of like, well, outrageous when you really sit down and think about it. Considering it more from a holistic point of view and not just focusing on, disorders of the reproductive tract, like changes in fertility and breast cancer, I think is really important. Coming back to this idea that only a few thousand doctors are trained in handling patients that are going through menopause in the country, there's over 50 million women in menopause right now. So those numbers, I think it's something, when you actually do the math, it's something like one doctor for every 30 some odd thousand women, which, it's absurd. I mean, it's just silly. It doesn't make any sense. So yeah, there's a huge opportunity for us to both encourage doctors to get this kind of training, but also to provide OBGYNs with the kind of information that would be useful about what's available now, what's on the horizon, the kinds of things they should be looking for in their patients. Like you said, it can be a constellation of symptoms that are not necessarily really easy to pinpoint or diagnose. And the window of time during which a woman goes through perimenopause and menopause is so huge, right? That's one of the questions that we want to answer on the basic science side, is why is it so variable at the level of the individual? But all of those things are hopefully pieces of the network and the information that we're trying to build out with the consortium. Secondary to that, the consortium is also giving out grants to basic scientists to try to both seed the field, to bring scientists in to work on this really important problem. But part of the reason that we're doing that is because the funding, on women's health, particularly by the NIH, which is the largest public funding body for health research in the US, has just not been, historically, has not been there both for women's health and also for reproductive aging. So we actually have a slide about this, which I'll pop up on the screen. We took a look at the numbers from 2018. So the NIH budget in 2018 was just over $36 billion, and that's in blue. And of that, only about 15%, or $5.5 billion, was devoted to all of women's health. And that covers women's health from conception through gestation, through early development and childhood and adolescence and young adulthood and middle life and old age and death, which is just, I would say probably not enough. And related to that, just, reproductive aging, which is what we're talking about. The numbers there are infinitesimally small, so 43 million, and we were very generous about what we were considering reproductive aging. So those things together, I think, have really made it difficult, if not impossible, for scientists to focus on this question. As a scientist, I am not able to work on a problem if I don't have funding to do it. So the GCRLE gave away $7.4 million in grants last year to 22 different researchers. And the goal really and truly is to bring in scientists from all over the world who are working on different problems, and to get the brightest and the most creative minds to focus on this problem so that we can actually get to the root cause. What is it that's causing the real causal factor? We know a lot about the downstream effects and the consequences of this reproductive decline, but what's actually the biological cue or the constellation of cues or timers that happen in a woman's body that so reproducibly cause her to start to decline in midlife. That's what we're trying to do. And talking about, coming back to this idea of women's health as a specialty or a niche thing, it's kind of a persistent feature across scientific culture too. right? So there's, the second piece of this, I would say, is the lack of data. We're starting from almost zero when I'm talking about the people we're funding to look into reproductive aging. There are a few things that we know, and there are some really promising directions in terms of the research in this area. But there have been biases and disparities and inequities in the biomedical research community that have essentially resulted in worse health outcomes for women, but also just an incredible lack of data. Just overall, the physiology of the female sex is understudied, and it's been purposefully excluded from scientific research for decades. So Daisy, I read a beautiful thought piece that you wrote on this exact topic. So I want to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, this is something that was so shocking to me as I started. It was like I pulled a thread and then started unraveling a sweater. It was just entirely shocking to me because what I learned as I was just trying to understand, as I mentioned before, female physiology and how things manifest differently in men versus women, what I found was that it wasn't actually until 2016, so that's 5 years ago, that the NIH, which we know is the largest biomedical funding institute, that they required grant recipients to include both sexes in studies, so both male and female animals to look at in physiologic studies.
So the male body is that, the male body has been biology's baseline, essentially.
Yeah, what that meant is that for all of the decades preceding that mandate, they put that in there because it was required, because people chose to focus on male subjects in their research, and that was because there was this belief that the cyclical fluctuation that occurs due to a menstrual or estrous cycle, depending on what animal you're studying, that it would be a confounding variable that would complicate the results, it would dirty up the data, and you wouldn't be able to glean as much from it because of that complexity. And what we fail to recognize is that a lot of the things that are happening in a female animal are actually deeply relevant to the health and well-being and whatever the thing is that we're studying. So this noise that we historically considered this cycling to be is actually a signal. And there's a lot of really interesting little factoids here. Maybe one of the most obvious to me to point out is that males have hormones too, and those levels change throughout time. And so that is a signal that is true in men as well as women. Ours just have, a monthly sort of cyclicality to it. But really, this has really blinded us to the specific vulnerabilities that afflict females, but also to the benefits of female physiology that could be, implemented or used to support male well-being. This was something that became really evident to me at the onset of the pandemic, because we saw really early on, I think, we went into lockdowns in the States in March of 2020. I think it was April when we started seeing data that showed that men were faring worse than women globally with regard to outcomes. And everyone was like, what's happening? Like, men are dying at a 2.4x rate. And there's a lot of factors here. Of course, there's some lifestyle factors and cultural factors and things like that. But we have actually known for decades that females they have a more robust immune system. They respond better to vaccines. They tend to activate more. It's actually partly why most likely that women tend to have more autoimmune disease, is because there's a sort of overactivity that can occur more often in females. And, had we thought to look into that more deeply, then maybe we would have been able to better support male immune systems when we have public health challenges that are infectious in nature. So, there's just a lot. That's just a couple little points. I could probably talk about this for a full hour or more with you, but that's just a few things that really underscore this. So much of our work to date, so much of the drug development that's been done to date has been put together and studied only using male as a baseline.
Yeah, this is wild.
It's really left us out. And led to a lot of poor outcomes for women in a clinical setting.
For women and honestly, for women and for men, we're talking about we're talking about differences that and holes in our knowledge that are just, like I said, wild. And coming back to something you said earlier, I think we're focusing on female reproductive aging. We think that this is a problem that needs to be solved first, but we're not ignoring men. And I think the idea that men also have hormones that change with age, and that change maybe not on the same kind of cyclical timescale, but do cycle. This is also really important and affects all sorts of things, like you alluded to. But separately, let's talk about, give me some examples. So what is it, what are the things that make women different? The things that, not having this data, what are the consequences of that? Like, what has actually happened? What are the real world examples of things that have happened directly because we have, 50 years of preclinical data that's almost exclusively in males?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but I think one of the biggest things that really stands out to me, I mean, there's kind of two pieces of it. And again, I'm sort of coming from a biotech translational point of view, which is to say, how do we take science and implement it in a medical setting for women or for people? And I think one of the biggest pieces is this diagnostic, and the heart attack example that I mentioned earlier is probably one of the best ones there is. We know that women often get misdiagnosed for heart attacks instead of being, when they're experiencing a heart attack and they, call the doctor or go into the hospital and express their symptoms, they're not treated for a heart attack because that's not recognized as normal classical symptomology of heart attacks. And so more women will die, more women will have complications. And that's true of a number of different presentations, a number of different diseases. And then on the flip side of that, or a counter to that, is in terms of how we actually treat the kinds of drugs we prescribe, for example, and how we measure that. And since we've historically done most of our clinical trials and most of our biomedical research in males, we actually have created treatment paradigms that better suit males as well. And so I think it's something like 8 out of the 10 drugs that have been pulled off the market for having adverse effects by the FDA disproportionately impact women negatively. And so you're having this huge set of negative impacts that happens specifically enriched in the female population because they weren't included in the design, they weren't included in the development. I mean, that's starting to change now. It was, I think, 1991. It was the early 90s when it was required to include women in clinical trials. So again, drugs take a really long time to develop. So it's only been the last handful of years that we've had robust clinical trial development with males and females for therapeutics. And same is true of the biomedical research. I mean, 2016, 5 or 6 years ago, we know that drugs take minimum like 10 years to get through. And so a lot of this early data that we have that's supporting how we manage disease and how we treat disease and how we recognize disease is really put together in male physiology. And so, we're doing a disservice to female people, but we're also, like we mentioned, we're also failing to capture interesting biology that could really support well-being of both sexes and more people. I mean, there's a gradient, right? There's always complexity with how we look at every person. And by trying to simplify everything down to the, most basic common denominator, we lose a lot of information that is going to help a lot of people. And in doing so, in the last couple of decades, we've really hurt a lot of people, actually.
Yeah. I mean, that idea that, at the level of the individual, things can be so distinct, is such an important idea to embrace when we're thinking about female reproductive aging, right? A woman's cycle is complex. Her ovaries are complex. And, at the level of the individual, fertility cycles are stochastic. Some young women go through periods of infertility, even when they're healthy. Some much older women go through periods of hyperfertility when they're least expecting it. But, you bring up a really just profound point, which is, what would we know about human biology if we had dedicated even a fraction of the same attention and resources to female physiology as we have to male physiology? And, we've talked about this before, Daisy, but I think this stretches much further than just like the male-female dynamic, and really extends to the broader diversity in our population, right? So much of our diagnostic criteria, so many of our therapeutics, like you said, have been developed for this very narrow group of people. And it's not good enough. We need to do better. It's obviously going to take more time, more energy, and more attention, and it'll probably be expensive, but this is what needs to happen. And, you know, on a positive note, there's a huge number of people who would be interested in these kinds of solutions, right? I mean, you're working on, you're working.
The market is huge. The market is huge. I mean, obviously there's the 50 million women in menopause who would love to have some solutions to
just
their
in the U.S. That's just in the U.S. 50 million, right?
Yeah, and of course all of the rest of the people that are, you know, men and women who are from various diverse backgrounds that aren't being served. But I think, you know, you mentioned just one thing I just wanted to kind of underscore here is that I think part of the problem, it is a hard problem to solve. It will take a lot of money. It will take more time, et cetera, et cetera. But I think a huge part of it is, you know, what you're doing with GCRLE and what we're doing here with Buck, doing this seminar is just raising the awareness. Because when I talk to people about this, friends and family and colleagues and at conferences, people are really shocked to learn that there's this huge bias that's just been persistent for decades and decades and decades and led us to this point where we're finally willing to recognize and speak about and ask for more to do better. And I think that that's huge, and it's really exciting that it's becoming something that's part of the conversation. I mean, every time I read the news, I feel like there's some women's health piece that's happening, which was not true even 2 years ago. Yeah. You know, it was a bit sporadic before that, and now it's becoming a conversation point, which is amazing.
It is amazing.
You have another totally point that I want to follow on, but I'm blanking on it.
Well, you think about that. I was gonna point out, because you said 50 million women, and that's true in the U.S. But I also wanted to point out that worldwide, you know, I think by 2025 the number is going to be over 1 billion women in menopause, which is going to be more than 10% of the world's population, and that's profound for many reasons, right? We have, you know, from a woman's both her overall health, right, because of those dramatic negative health effects of going through menopause that are serious risk for disease like heart disease and stroke and cognitive decline. Those are real costs. But separately from that, you know, the things that people refer to as kind of the less dramatic symptoms of menopause, the vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes and trouble sleeping and brain fog, those things lead to not just a decline in a woman's quality of life, but also like really lost productivity, right? Because if you're experiencing brain fog and you can't sleep and you're having hot flashes all the time, you know, being focused and productive in your job is going to be difficult. So we actually made a slide about this too. The overall cost of menopause is dramatic. And it's only going to get bigger. So, you know, the annual healthcare costs, the cost from economic costs from lost productivity are close to $1 trillion a year. And that's, you know, that's a low estimate. So everyone should be talking about this. I don't understand why there aren't more people talking about this. So let's talk about some solutions. We've identified some problems, right? A lack of funding, a lack of data, and of course, NIH making grant holders responsible to use both males and females in their research is a really amazing step forward. And that's been going on for 5 years, and it will continue. That's a great start. And of course, the GCRLE is funding grants on female reproductive aging. The National Academy of Medicine recently decided to include female reproductive aging as one of the criteria for their Catalyst Awards. I know, right? Yay, go NAM. And the Catalyst Awards are their funding mechanism to try to encourage scientists to work on healthy longevity problems. But what else? Like, what else is there?
Well, I mean, I think it's a number of things. I mean, I think the awareness is huge. I think education is huge. We really started this conversation by talking about getting into this space by basically recognizing our ignorance. So I feel like if we start showing people their ignorance in this space, hopefully they'll be as horrified as we are and realize, oh my God, I need to know more so that I can be okay. You know, so to me, a big piece of it is just education, and that's I'm not sure the best way to do that. I think seminars like these are super helpful, but I think there need to be broader interventions as well. And the fact that we are seeing more pieces in the news around this is really encouraging to me, because it means there's more visibility to these kinds of problems. And then that turns into, more of a desire that then is fed up to other places where people recognize, oh, there is a market willing to buy, which I think is a huge part of it. We need the funding to do this research. We need the buyers and the consumers to want the products that are being developed in order for someone to put the development money into it. I mean, I've talked to so many people in the last, couple of years about different aspects of women's health and women's health companies and therapeutics that are being developed, and just in my own education of understanding what's the landscape like. And what I've heard so much is a lot of these companies just couldn't get funding for years and years and years, and whatever funding they could get was just not very much. And when you look at some of these other types of biotech companies, for example, or tech companies even, that get money, there's huge amounts of money that go into cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes. And, the volume of people that we're talking about that this affects is huge. There's not just women's health and menopause in particular, and fertility in particular, but you talk about things like endometriosis and PCOS and these very specific conditions that just don't have options that are viable. And it's really shocking, and it's really horrible, the types of symptoms that these patients experience. So yeah. I think funding is a big piece of it. I think it's tied to the awareness piece. And, we need the talent to drive that. So we need people to go into their clinical training, to go into scientific fields, to go into, public health oriented fields, interested in promoting work in women's health. And that's something that I think also the GCRLE is doing really wonderfully, is sort of convening a network of people where we can have this wonderful resource that then can sort of filter out and help to stimulate, okay, like this is what we need. These are the types of people that we need to train to help support this. I mean, there's a lot to do.
There's a lot to do, yeah. And that is part of what we're trying to do. I think since we're doing this from the beginning, we can build it however we want. And a large part of our focus really is to try to nucleate these conversations between people who would not normally talk to each other. So like you and me, for example, scientist at the bench, running a lab, and then an entrepreneur and a CEO of a company. Those conversations are rare. And so one of the things we've done with our grantees is, we want to identify as early as possible things in their labs, things that they're discovering that could be translatable. That doesn't mean there will be anything translatable, and that's okay, because basic science is really, discovering those basic mechanisms of what's happening is what's important. But in those instances where there is something that's translatable, we want to help them recognize that early on. So we put together a translational advisory board of experts in R&D and translation. And the Bia Echo Foundation has been really, I think, prescient in recognizing this as an important problem. But like you said, there's also a lack of funding for early stage companies that are working in this space. And so, we're working on a model right now to try to maybe incubate some of those companies and to bring together the funders and the people with the ideas so that we can push things forward faster. Okay, so sustainable funding, that's one thing. Increased public engagement, supporting scientists and the science, for sure. And so those of you watching this, I'm talking to you. And I think there's just a set of challenges that we need to address in terms of public engagement. Scientists are terrible about communicating their work to the rest of the world. And so that's part of what we're trying to do here with the webinars. So to the extent that all of you can have conversations to help nurture this field, we would love for you to explain what we're doing, to talk about what we're doing. You can find information on our website. We wrote a white paper about this that's written for non-scientists. It's on the Buck Institute website at GCRLE. We also have a discussion forum at gcrle.org, which, those of you who are watching, if you want to put questions into the chat box, we'll get to those in a minute. But if we don't get to all of them, we will continue the discussion at gcrle.org. We'll start a thread for each webinar and answer questions there, either in real time, right after we're done talking, but continuing, in the weeks following the webinar, we will continue to have that discussion if you want to have it. So Daisy, I want to talk a little bit about what you're doing. So you started this company, which is in the space, Oviva Therapeutics. So I want to hear, what's the premise? What's your vision?
Yeah, it's so exciting. So we started Oviva. I guess the real idea for it came quite a long time ago when I was doing this kind of discovery of the landscape of women's health and interfacing that with my own background in aging biology and really recognizing that there's this little gap that exists for some reason, even though to me it was quite plain, of the ovaries being a key to health and longevity in people, especially female people, obviously. And so the thesis was really, how can we support ovarian function so that we can improve longevity and really improve health span in women? And that really was what seeded the idea for the company. And there's some really interesting data out there that helped us support this hypothesis. I mean, one of them being that if you take younger ovaries of mice and transplant them into older mice, you can extend the lifespan of those older animals by 11%. I mean, that's just a very interesting finding in and of itself.
It's crazy.
And it's crazy. And, it goes to say, if we can find a way to rejuvenate ovaries to restore their function, there is capacity for us to improve the well-being and reduce that decline that so many women see once they enter that menopause transition. And that's really our vision, is to support that. And I think that there's a lot of mechanisms to move forward and achieve that goal, which I want to just recognize right off the bat. I think there's so much work that's being done, and there's a lot of really interesting work being done at the GCRLE, but also globally, that's exploring how we can understand but also manipulate the ovaries themselves to better support their function and well-being. We are taking a very specific tack because we're a biotechnology company. We have an R&D program. We have a very specific set of goals and milestones that we aim to achieve in the near term that help to support the hypothesis and the thesis. And simultaneously, we're keeping our eyes open to other interesting science that, like you mentioned earlier, could be translated to support this goal of improving ovarian function. Because I think ultimately there's going to be a number of different avenues, and those are going to work differently for different people. And it's like any kind of biology. I mean, we're all unique in our biology, and there's going to need to be specific solutions for specific circumstances. And so we're taking a first stab at it by targeting a hormonal axis that actually has never been therapeutically targeted before. And that's of the axis of anti-Müllerian hormone and its receptor, AMHR2. Most of the hormones most of the hormonal axes that are targeted therapeutically are either birth control kinds of things or like estrogen replacement therapy, things of that nature. And those hormones tend to operate sort of later in the maturation cycle of the structures within the ovaries that control the ovarian function, the follicles. And so AMH is actually a much earlier intervention point. Mm-hmm. And what we hope to do with what we're developing is to control the ovarian reserve. And the ovarian reserve is the structure in the ovaries that contains all of the eggs. Mm-hmm. Of course, we all know that women are born with all the eggs that they'll ever really have right at birth. They're actually already declined by the time you're born. I think you have about 6 or 7 million when you're 20 to 26 weeks in utero as a female baby. You're born with 1 million, and then by the time you hit puberty, you have just 1% of that original number. You have 300,000 or so.
Yeah, by the time you want to use them.
By the time you want to use them, you already spent most of them, and then you spend 1,000 a month with only one of the eggs becoming viable, obviously, right, for fertilization for the most part. And so what we want to do is better control how that happens so that we can, presumably, the hypothesis would be that we can sort of push out that time point at which you would enter menopause. And ideally, we would be able to forestall that entirely and just prevent somebody from entering menopause, mm-hmm, so that we can just retain the same kind of homeostasis that we experience throughout our lives. Mm-hmm. And again, this is just one hypothesis under the greater hypothesis of supporting ovarian function, which, I don't think we're going to be transplanting young ovaries into older women anytime soon. That sounds a bit sci-fi, but I think there's going to be a lot of different methods.
Probably some issues around that, but yeah.
There's a little bit of ethics that are strange there, but, we do have those people injecting young blood into themselves, so...
Yeah, we're not going to go there.
Put it past anybody. We won't go there. I guess my point is saying that's not at all what we're trying to do.
That's not what you're doing.
It's not what we're doing. I recognize, though, that there's a lot of really interesting biology beyond just the specific thing that we're focused on. And so as somebody who's really dedicated to the broader mission, that's something that I really want to elevate in what we're doing, both from the standpoint of we have this specific path we're taking, but also a rising tide lifts all boats. We want to help elevate the field. We want to support other people, whether that's advising for other companies, whether that's, talking and connecting with academic scientists, whether that's at the future we tack on other programs that are looking at these other aspects of ovarian physiology that we think we can support to extend ovarian function. Ultimately, what we really want to do is address the vast unmet need in women's health and really think carefully about how the ovaries are aging and how can we support them to maintain their function for as long as possible so that we can keep improving well-being for women for as many years as possible so they can have and enjoy a health span that is more closely matched to their lifespan, as is true for male people.
That is basically the perfect place to leave our conversation and move on to the questions. And I have to say, I really appreciate what you just said. And this is, you have encompassed most of my experience talking to people in the space, especially on the early biotech side. There are so many people who have both a scientific interest and also maybe an entrepreneurial interest in this area who are motivated by genuinely wanting to advance the field and genuinely wanting to get products and therapeutics into women's hands faster. It's an amazing space to be working in, and I'm really excited to continue to host people like you here on the webinar. So let me get some of these questions up. All right, so one person asks, what can we in the audience do to help support these efforts today? Oh, well, we touched on a few things. I would say that just engaging and learning and spreading the word about what we're doing is something that is profoundly important. I can't emphasize enough how important the non-scientist ambassadors are to not just talk about what we're doing, but to learn about their own bodies and to think about how we can work together essentially to let's get rid of menopause. Do you have any other ideas, Daisy?
I think that's really it. I mean, I think that having the advocacy piece is really important. And if you're a non-scientist person, there's a huge way to contribute to the field by just being engaged in learning and continuing to have the conversations and spreading the awareness. I mean, I've said this a number of times, but certainly one of my core personal missions is just having people learn and understand their bodies more so that they can better prepare for these sorts of things. And I think that the more that we do that and the more that we globally recognize that there's this huge unmet need, there will just be such a hunger for it. And I think that the economy will respond, the scientific enterprise will respond, biotechnology will respond, and that takes engagement from people on the other side that aren't actually actively doing the bench work necessarily.
Yeah. I think we also need to diversify the funders in this space. The Echo Foundation has been amazing as the seed funder, but we need to bring more capital into this area, both on the academic side and on the private sector side. So I would add that. Related to that, there's a question. She says, it's amazing to hear about the surge in interest from the private sector. What other companies are out there that we should know about? And related to that, what is missing from what currently exists? Daisy, I'll let you take this one first.
Oh my God, what is missing? So many things. I mean, the immediate thing that comes to mind is just the lack of the doctors trained in menopause, for example. So I think that there's a lot of funding missing. I think there's a lot of talent missing of people who can be going into this space to invigorate with their ideas and their perspectives to help us really nail down some of these open questions in biology that we don't understand that are going to help really move the needle forward. In terms of when I think of what's missing, I'm like, God, there's so much. Which to me, when you say we can diversify funders, I mean, there's so much upside here. The market is just empty. There's nothing there for us. And so there's all this space and room to create and to innovate and to try things that has a huge upside potential. So I'll just underscore that again. There are a lot of really interesting companies that have started in the last 5 to 10 years that I think are worth keeping an eye on. I mean, I definitely don't have an exhaustive list, but I've learned about them just in my own kind of perusal of women's health companies. There's some very cool ones like Electra Health, which is focused on basically providing resources about menopause and educating people about menopause and perimenopause and symptoms to look for and different things you can try to modulate symptoms. I mean, that's more an educational platform than a therapeutics development space, but I think it's equally important, especially in today's landscape.
I think we just lost Daisy. Yeah, it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. So, you know what? I think this might be a good time to switch over to juicyearly.org. We're going to go there. We're going to open a discussion forum to answer all of the questions that we didn't get to. I can see there are quite a few in the chat. And I want to thank Daisy Robinton for joining us. We're so lucky to have her today, and she'll also be joining us in the chat if you want to ask questions. We'll be answering them not just today, but in the future. And I would love for everyone to come back and join us next time. We're going to take a break for the holidays, and we'll be back on October 7th. And Dina Amira, who is an evolutionary biologist, is going to join me to talk about the evolutionary insights that we can get into female reproductive biology. Remember, we humans are very odd in that there aren't very many species that go through menopause. So, for those of you who haven't watched this before, OVA Hour is brought to you by the Buck Institute, and we are trying to connect to you in the community to bring you information, webinars, hopefully events when we can be in person again. And so please go and sign up if you haven't already at the Buck Institute website, and that's it. So thank you, everyone.